Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. David Cooper. He is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Durham University, and today we're talking about his book, Pessimism, Quietism and Nature as Refuge. So, Dr. Cooper, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Right, well, thank you very much for having me on your show.
Okay, so let me ask you first, what is misanthropy?
Well, I think one needs to distinguish vernacular, everyday senses of misanthropy from, as it were, philosophical misanthropy. I mean, I take it that in the everyday sense, misanthropy is something like hatred of people or Scrooge-like meanness. I take philosophical misanthropy to essentially be a negative judgment on the human condition. The claim that human life is saturated with failings and vices like hypocrisy, cruelty, greed, vanity, and so on. And I think it's perhaps worth adding that I think the philosophical misanthrope's target is individual people. It's not a claim about you or me being particularly awful. It's a claim about something rather more abstract, the human condition, the human form of life, human existence as we now know it, something like that.
And what is pessimism?
Pessimism. Well, again, I think one needs to distinguish sort of everyday senses of the term from its use in philosophical literature. I mean, I take it that in everyday discourse, a pessimist is somebody who, I don't know, feels that things are going to keep turning out badly. It's going to rain tomorrow instead of being sunny during the garden party. Philosophical pessimist, it seems to me, is again making two judgments, negative judgments. I mean, first, that the human condition is a bad one, in that suffering, unhappiness, anxiety, frustration, and so on greatly outweigh their opposites. And the second negative judgment is that, it's just very unlikely that this condition can be substantially or radically improved. So.
And how does pessimism then combine with misanthropy? And is there a specific kind of misanthropy that results from pessimism?
Well, I certainly don't think that pessimism and misanthropy entail one another. You can be a pessimist without being a misanthrope. For example, you may think that our condition is a very bad one. We suffer a lot, but that this isn't our fault. I mean, it's just bad luck, or it's the machinations of the devil, or whatever. Again, you could be a misanthrope without being a pessimist. You might think that we're indeed pretty morally awful, but that salvation is around the corner. The communist revolution or the second coming of Christ or whatever, and everything will be fine. But, generally, it seems to me that pessimism and misanthropy are mutually supporting. I mean, if the pessimist, if the pessimist is right and life is largely suffering, then this is liable to exacerbate the very failings and vices that the misanthrope identifies. And then conversely, if we're so full of failings and vices as the misanthrope claims, then we don't have the moral resources to really improve the human condition. So it's plausible, I think, to think that they're going to go together in a mutually supportive way. And then, sorry, the second half of your question was?
I think that you've ended up already answering it, at least in part. It was if there's a specific kind of misanthropy that results from pessimism.
Yes, I certainly think that the basis of your pessimistic view is going to affect the form that your misanthropy takes. For example, very important example, it seems to me that for the Buddha and for Schopenhauer, for example, our condition of suffering is primarily the product of our being creatures of, as it were, insatiable desires. And it's these desires, in the form of greed, overweening ambition, jealousy, and so on, that are going to be at the root of our failings and vices on one version of misanthropy.
Right. And how would you characterize the human condition?
Well, I think in the way that the pessimist and the misanthrope do. That, on balance, our condition is an unhappy one that is both fed by and feeds into humankind's very deeply entrenched failures and vices.
And do you think it's really impossible to ameliorate the human condition?
Well, yes, I'm afraid I do, in any kind of really substantial, radical way. And that's because, as I see it, our failings are really very deeply entrenched. They're not the product of passing social, political, or economic conditions that might be reformed. If the human condition is radically to improve, it seems to me that, in effect, it would no longer be the human condition at all. It would be the condition of creatures like us in some ways, but no longer with our structures of desires, ambitions, and sort of self-obsession.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was asking you that because there is a specific kind of misanthrope. There is the activist misanthrope who, at least to a certain extent, believes that we can ameliorate humankind, correct?
Yeah. My reply, I think, is that, the amelioration is going to be very limited. Of course, one can, and indeed should, intervene with modesty, I think, and usually locally and on a small scale, intervene to improve people's lives and perhaps to help redress some of their failings. But I do think it's unrealistic to suppose there can be any grand scale amelioration of the human condition as dreamt of by communist revolutionaries, various kinds of theocrats, and so on. The evidence of history is not supportive, I think, of such huge, large-scale, as it were, utopian ambitions. They seem to me to lack realism. They also, I think, just ignore the really basic elements and aspects of human suffering, which I don't think are going to be changed by political, economic revolutions. The pains and anxieties and suffering of old age, of various kinds of addictions, and so on. So,
How should...
No, sorry.
No,
continue.
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, so I was just going to sort of briefly sum up and say that I think the prospects for big cause activism limited. There's a lack of realism here.
Mhm. And how should one respond to one's negative assessment of the human condition? I mean, what should we do?
Well, I think, unless you take to drinking or drugs or whatever to blot out and forget your negative assessment of the human condition, this assessment is bound to produce, I think, what I call in the book disquiet, perhaps depression, even despair, frustration, and so on. And that's an unhappy state to be in. So one should ask oneself, how one might live in order to accommodate or perhaps mitigate such disquiet, whether by, say, dropping out through militant activism or what. And my answer is that one should respond to one's assessment of the condition through a certain, as it were, quietistic style of life and attitude.
Okay, but what is quietism then, and philosophical quietism more specifically?
Well, I think, the term quietism has been used to refer to a number of different, as it were, attitudes or styles of life. But I think probably what all of these have in common are something like the following features. First, I think a kind of realistic acceptance of things, accompanied therefore by a kind of humility or modesty concerning your prospects or capacity radically to change things. And this accompanied with a kind of prizing of tranquility, equanimity, and various, one might call them quiet virtues like patience and care. I think, those features are probably common to what one regards as a quietist approach to things. Philosophical quietism, I think the term's a bit ambiguous. If you Google philosophical quietism, you get an account of the philosophy of the later Wittgenstein. Because, I think in the 1990s, the term Wittgensteinian quietism was coined to refer to a certain, as it were, style of philosophizing associated allegedly with the later Wittgenstein. So, on this view, the job of philosophy is not to answer questions by producing theories. It's to recognize that the questions are in some sense unreal, that you only ask them because you're confused, and that therefore the philosopher's job is to dissolve these questions, and with that dissolution comes, as it were, a certain tranquility. It brings peace, as Wittgenstein put it. I think very important too, while we're on Wittgenstein, is another strand in his thinking, very apparent in his book on certainty. And this is the idea that there's a lot of things we just have to accept. We can't question them because they're the very basis for anything that we can question and think about. So you can't sensibly question, for example, the claim that the world's existed for more than 5 minutes. Because, that the world has existed for more than 5 minutes is presupposed by just about everything we think and talk about. But I think philosophical quietism, can mean things other than a Wittgensteinian approach to philosophy. For example, you have the idea, say, amongst the Epicureans, that philosophy is a very important part of the quietist life. You should live quietistically, very modestly, without too many ambitions. But part and parcel of that involves philosophical reflection. For example, philosophical reflection will show you that death is not very important. And that helps you live more tranquilly. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are at least senses of, I think, philosophical quietism.
Right. And tell us about how it draws from Buddhist and Taoist ideas as well as those from Western philosophy.
Right. I mean, I think that the ideas I take or borrow from Buddhism and Taoism are actually very much shared by many ancient Western philosophers. Epicurus, the Stoics, for example. All of them, for example, emphasize self-restraint, moderation, tranquility, and the like. But yeah, I mean, I think there are some ideas from Buddhism and Taoism, respectively, that are very characteristic of them that I draw on. And I think from Buddhism, I draw the idea that generally we massively exaggerate the degree to which we're, as it were, masters of our own lives, that we're self-governing. We ignore, that is, our susceptibility to chance, change, contingency. Factors outside of our control. I mean, I think the famous Buddhist doctrine of not self, is really best understood as a denial that we're, as it were, masters of ourselves. And this idea, I think, promotes a certain humility and a reluctance to, as it were, commit oneself too heavily to long-term ambitions, because they're very likely to fail and result in disappointment and suffering. From Taoism, I take the very central Taoist idea, or indeed ideal, of what they call Wu Wei, which literally means, I think, not doing. But of course, Chuang-Tzu and other Taoist sages, they're not advocating that we become couch potatoes and just never do anything, just sit around. What they're advocating is a certain style, I think, of acting, one that's found amongst very skilled craftsmen, adept swimmers, good musicians. And this is a kind of non-contending, non-rigid, non-impositional style of action, one that's supple, responsive, involves spontaneity, maybe, in modern terminology, goes with the flow. And I think this idea, Wu Wei, indicates an important dimension of the quietist life.
Do you think that quietism can be a form of egoism?
Well, I think it could be. I noted earlier a rather pejorative sense of quietism, where, the quietist is somebody who's just indifferent to everything except, presumably, his own well-being. But I think a quietist of the kind I've been describing, is not at all an egoist. The quietist I've been describing is concerned to avoid the failings and vices identified by the misanthrope, and to exercise various virtues like humility, self-honesty, compassion. And keen to engage in, as it were, suitably modest local endeavours to help other people, perhaps help them redress their failings. The quietist probably won't be found marching on a just stop oil march, more likely to be cleaning up the local river.
Mm-hmm.
And in so doing, it seems to me, contributing to people's well-being rather more than marching down the street. After all, you only have so many hours in the day, and I think you can contribute more to human well-being by cleaning up the local river, helping your neighbour who's in trouble, volunteering for a local animal charity. You can do considerably more that way than by waving flags on big cause demonstrations. Could I just add one little thing? I do think it's a bad mistake to think that because the question that the quietist asks, that because that's a personal, self-directed question, how can I best conduct my life? It's a mistake to think that the answer to that question has to be in terms of one's personal self-advantage at the expense of other people and other creatures. That's just an error of logic, I think.
Right. And what does quietism entail in terms of how we live our lives? How should the quietist live his life?
Well, I don't think the quietist advocates, in detail any particular way you should live. He doesn't, for example, tell you that you should go in for this sort of career rather than that, although there's probably some careers he'd advise you to avoid. What's advocated, I think, is the kind of more general style of living and attitude that I tried to describe a little earlier. One thing I think that quietist authors sometimes, and I think it's a good thing, do, is to, point to exemplars, if you like, moral exemplars. The Buddha, say, or the Taoist sage, or Montaigne, perhaps, and say, well, look, that's a pretty good life, it seems to me. Look at it and see what you might be able to take from it and incorporate into your own life.
So, to refer to the title of your book, what is a place of refuge?
Well, I use the word place here figuratively or metaphorically. Buddhists take refuge, as it said, in the Buddha and his teachings and the community of monks. Well, clearly that's not a place. And I think even when there is a literal physical place, a monastery, for example, that you take refuge in, it's not the physical place itself that's the refuge, but, so to speak, the kind of context it provides. And so by a refuge, I mean something like, a context apart from, aside from the all too human world of busyness, ambitions, prejudices, jealousies, and so on, a context that offers some relief, temporarily at least, from disquiet, as I called it.
About the idea of nature as refuge, Why do you suggest finding places of refuge in natural environments?
Well, I think if you look at the sort of literature on refuge, there are many possible places or contexts that get mentioned. For example, music, art, the hermit's cave, monasteries, and so on can all be regarded as refuges from the all too human world. But I think the one that is most frequently discussed, and that's one reason I discuss it, is, nature as refuge. And it happens to be the one I think that, resonates with me personally most, though I think music probably comes a close second.
Why is nature a quote unquote another place? What is another place?
I think what I meant by this was something like the following. As it were, the world of nature is another place from the human world because our understanding and experience of it isn't tied to the utility and functions that things have for us, which of course is the case, I think, in the human world of artifacts, buildings, and so on. I mean, just look around you now, the laptop in front of you, a coffee cup perhaps, a carpet, a window frame. All of these things are understood in terms of utility and functions in relation to sort of human aims and goals. Whereas it's not like that with nature. We don't, when we are in natural surroundings, experience everything as, what Heidegger called equipment. And maybe perhaps one could add this too. I think there's perhaps another sense in which people speak of nature as being other, namely that nature for many people retains a certain kind of sort of mystery and unfathomableness. It's a place of wonder for many people. And that makes it very different from the human world, I think, which doesn't attract such attitudes. I mean, I don't think things in the human world are full of mystery. I mean, I may not understand how computers work, but I could probably find out if I read up on it and ask an expert. Whereas I think the kind of mystery that people associate with nature isn't of that kind. You can't solve it by reading up or asking some expert.
And what do we gain from refuging in nature? What effects does it have on us?
Well, I hope, this is the idea, that you gain relief, if only temporarily, from disquiet, a sense of emancipation or liberation from the all too human world, as well, of course, as experiencing a great deal of beauty and, if you like, wonder. So that's quite a lot, I think, to get or gain. I mean, also it's worth mentioning, I haven't thought about this one too much, but there's now a huge literature on and a big industry of, nature therapy, nature cures, such as forest bathing or wild swimming, therapies that are intended to promote benefits of health and wellness through engagement with nature. And, I'm sure there are such physical and mental health benefits. But I think one's also got to be alert to certain dangers in this therapeutic emphasis on turning to nature. There's the danger, isn't it, of, as it were, turning nature into a kind of commodity as a kind of outdoor gymnasium, and thereby bringing it into the world of equipment. You are, as it were, now sucking the natural world into the very human world from which you were, as it were, seeking refuge. So I'm a bit ambivalent about at least some forms of sort of nature therapy.
Can a refuge in nature only be sought by individuals, or can society itself do it?
Well, I think there'd be something a bit strange in the idea of a society seeking refuge in nature, because I think that'd be sort of, as it were, seeking refuge from itself. What I take it is possible are, communal and political initiatives to promote the idea of and to provide opportunities for finding refuge in nature. For example, protection of wild areas, support for allotments, garden allotments in cities, cleaning up rivers and so on. But I suppose I would add, being a pessimist, just don't expect too much here. One fears that economic imperatives are liable to prevail over even well-intentioned political communal initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that refuge in nature also connect to a desire to preserve the natural world from human activity?
Well, I think it would be strange for someone who, as it were, finds or at any rate looks for refuge in nature, to be indifferent to, say, deforestation or loss of animal habitats and so on. But I think it's an important point to make here. I mean, I don't think nature should be equated with wilderness. Okay. The natural is around us, or pretty close to us, most of the time. I mean, even in cities, you've got parks, gardens, allotments, and so on, where natural processes, nature, if you like, is at work. And so while I think the person seeking refuge in nature is, of course, going to want to see wildness preserved as well, I think he's also going to emphasize, look, you can find the natural going on all over the place, in your garden and so on, and focus perhaps on that. Not all of us, after all, can afford flights to the remote parts of Alaska or somewhere. So, get as much as you can out of, contact with nature in your local park.
Right. So I have one last question then. Do you think that through quietism, there's a risk of falling into the feelings that lead to the very same condition we are refuging from?
Yes. I mean, I think you wouldn't be a good pessimist or misanthropist if you didn't think there was such a risk, I think. I mean, there is the danger, I think, that the ambitions, jealousies, vanities, and so on that permeate the human world, the everyday world of human existence, that these can, as it were, get transported or into people's dealings with nature. I mean, I think one sees this even in a small way with very competitive bird watching, where one gets the feeling the important thing is not the birds, but how many you've seen and whether you win a prize. ecotourism. I think a lot of ecotourism may be permeated by these kind of vices. So, who's seen the most lions on your safari holiday? How many hours did it take you to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and so on? It's just not easy, it seems to me. How could a pessimist or a misanthrope think it was easy? It's not easy to leave behind the failings that infect our everyday lives when engaging with the natural world. After all, it's worth mentioning, isn't it, that unfortunately, for a very large number of people, their favourite way of engaging with nature is by killing things, shooting, fishing, trapping, whatever it happens to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So the book is again Pessimism, Quietism, and Nature as Refuge. I am leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Cooper, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you very much indeed for all your questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.